Hi everybody, my name is Mark Victor, the founder of the Live and Let Live movement. And this is video number 2 in our initial series, which is sort of an overview of the philosophy of the Live and Let Live movement. And really this video is more of just a 30,000-foot overview of what the philosophy is. I'm not going to get into any real deep dives, but there will be another video. In fact, the next video is going to be the deeper dive into rule number 1, which is the legal principle. But for today, I'm going to keep it right around 30,000-foot view. First, a couple of comments, just to sort of position where we are. We in the Live and Let Live movement, we're not trying to force our personal opinions on other people. In fact, later on, I'll do another video. And in the book I've written, I've covered several different issues, and you'll find I never give my personal opinion on any particular issue because it doesn't matter. What we're trying to do here with the Live and Let Live movement is get to a place, a philosophy, rules, if you will, so we can live together, even with people who have very different opinions on how other people should live. And so that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to push our personal positions on other people. In essence, what I'm trying to say is we want to remove morality from the law. So think of it like that. And the reason we're doing this is so people with different opinions and different moral opinions, different ethics, so they can live together on the planet and get along. So in order to understand this as an initial matter, you really need to understand the difference between what I'll refer to as a legal rule and what I'll refer to as a moral rule. The main difference is if you violate a legal rule, there's going to be some type of formal, maybe societal, if you think about it that way, a consequence. In other words, we can do something to you for violating a legal rule. This could be, in the most serious cases, in the criminal variety of cases, we can talk about jail or prison. There can be fines. You could be put on probation. And in civil type cases, you could be ordered to reimburse somebody maybe who you've damaged. Think of an auto accident or something like that. You have to pay damages to somebody else. That's the way the world works now for legal rules. Moral rules are completely different. If you violate a moral rule, there's no formal societal consequence. All right, you might lose some friends, people might be unhappy with you, but you don't have a trial when you're accused of violating a moral rule. So we got to be very clear on the differences between legal rules and moral rules. And so as I'm going to go through this with you now, I'm going to ask you to do something. Maybe think of it like a thought experiment. What I'd like you to do is forget about everything that, let's just say, the Republicans have said or the Democrats have said if you're in the United States. If you're in a different country, forget everything that all of the political parties have said or are saying now. Can we just start from scratch? Clear your brain. If you're old enough and you remember the Etch-a-Sketch, swipe the Etch-a-Sketch and let's start from scratch. Let's start from the beginning and think, what makes sense for human beings to live with each other? What rules make the most sense? And my question for you here is, how do you feel about aggression? I'm not going to get into too deep of a dive into what exactly aggression is, but think about punching somebody, stealing their things, frauding somebody, those kinds of things, being an aggressor towards another person or their property. How do you feel about that? I can tell you how we in the Live and Let Live movement feel about it. We're against it, and we're against it on all issues, at all times, in all cases, whether we're dealing with people or groups or corporations or governments. Whatever the issue is, we're against aggression. This should be our absolute minimum standard of conduct. Now you might say, hey Mark, aggression, this rule against aggression, this is sort of a moral rule, right? You could say the law of murder, the law of assault, these are moral ideas. Fair enough. But it's what I like to call the least common denominator of morality. It's the part of morality that all reasonable people can agree upon. This idea, don't aggress against your fellow humans. And because it's the least common denominator, that's the part that we import into the law. Don't be an aggressor. That's our legal principle. I sometimes call it rule number one. It's important to think about it as rule number one, because without rule number one, the rule against aggression, making other rules doesn't even make sense, right? If we're hitting each other over the head, any other rules that you make at that point probably don't make any sense. It has to be our first rule. Think about maybe people many, many centuries ago didn't get along, warring tribes, if you will. What could be the very first rule that they would agree on, right? The number one rule. How about you leave me alone and I'll leave you alone? You don't take my stuff, I won't take your stuff. It's the first rule that people who disagree on everything else about the world, it's the first rule that they could possibly agree on. And again, there are no exceptions for anybody here. And it doesn't matter where you were born. It doesn't matter what color your skin is. It doesn't matter if you're religious or not religious, or who you love, or what holidays you celebrate. We treat everybody exactly the same way. Said another way, we hold everybody to the same standard. Nobody gets to aggress against another person, even if they're aggressing for what could ultimately be a good moral cause, right? Think of somebody who steals somebody's money and then uses it for a good purpose. What we're saying in the Live and Let Live movement is, while it may be a good purpose, you still don't get to steal somebody's money. That first wrong doesn't fix maybe the good deed of giving the money to a worthy cause. We do want to get the worthy cause done, but not while we're violating rule number one. Because if you think about it, if we can violate rule number one to force our views on other people, guess what? Other people will also want to violate rule number one. They'll say, oh, you mean you can aggress to get done what you want to get done? Well, I want to aggress too. And here, not everybody agrees on morality. So this will set up an endless war of all against all. Sound familiar? It's kind of like what we have now. In fact, if you want to think about it in terms of political parties, we, the people in the Live and Let Live movement, are saying we don't aggress at all. We're always against aggression in all cases, on all issues, for all people, groups, corporations, and governments. Then there are groups who want to aggress. If you're in the United States, think about this as the Republicans and the Democrats. One thing they agree on is aggression is okay. You can force other people to do things. You can take their money and spend it whether they like it or not. You can tell them how to live. The only thing they're arguing about is in what areas and for what purposes and to what extent can people be aggressed upon. We don't reach those questions. What we say is no aggression. And in that regard, there really only are two groups. Those who are against aggression, which is the Live and Let Livers, and everybody else who is for aggression and is only having an argument about in what areas they should aggress against you. So I'm going to get much deeper into the rule number one, the legal principle, in the next video. We're going to take a good hard look on exactly what's aggression, how do we identify aggression, what are serious violations of the legal principle, and then less serious violations of the legal principle. But I'm going to leave that for next time. Well, that's half of the rules that we have in Live and Let Live. We only have two rules. You got rule number one, don't be an aggressor. That's our legal principle. The only rule left is rule number two. This is our moral principle. And we describe this moral principle with the short phrase, just be a good human. Be a good human. Now, I'm going to do a deep dive into this as well, but I suspect you got a pretty good idea of what it means to be a good human. You had a decent parent or somebody who raised you, or maybe you went to kindergarten, you probably got pretty good feel of what it means to be a good human. But just in case you need some more guidance, we have a list of what we call aspirational values. I'm not going to go through them all now. I'll talk about them when we get to that video on rule number two, the moral principle. But the aspirational values are what we call a non-exhaustive list. There could be other things that could be on that list, but it's just a list to provide some guidance in terms of what we think in the Live and Let Live movement, what we mean by be a good human. Now, we're encouraging people to be good humans. We're not forcing them to be good humans. So I want to be very clear about the difference between rule number 1 and rule number 2. There are 2 differences, right? First difference, well, they're different rules, right? Rule number 1, don't be an aggressor. Rule number 2, be a good human. But there's yet a very important second distinction between the 2 rules. Rule number 1 is mandatory. There's no option to be an aggressor. We're not suggesting the law ought to allow people to choose to be aggressors. Sorry, you don't get to be an aggressor. Doesn't really matter that you didn't consent. If somebody's trying to steal your wallet, you're justified in stopping them. Even if they say, I never agreed to rule number 1, right? You don't get to be an aggressor. This is not an optional rule. We intend that everybody should be held to that standard. Rule number 2, be a good human, completely optional. Well, we feel very strongly about trying to convince you to be a good human. We have lots of good reasons that we think it'll improve your life if you follow the aspirational values. You have every right to say, Mark, I don't care about being a good human. I'm not interested. I don't like any of those aspirational values. To you, we say, okay, fine. You're not part of the Live and Let Live movement because there are really 2 requirements to be part of the Live and Let Live movement. You agree with rule number 1, don't be an aggressor, and you agree with rule number 2, be a good human. And if somebody says, I don't agree with either one of those rules, okay, they're not a good fit for the Live and Let Live movement. But people are free to disagree with rule number 2 so long as they don't violate rule number 1. And we need to defend their rights to live however they want to live, so long as they don't violate rule number 1. This isn't so far away from how we feel about free speech, right? We generally understand we defend the rights of people to say even things we totally disagree with, things that are horribly offensive, totally wrong, immoral, unwise. No matter how much we disagree with what other people are saying, if you believe in the right to freedom of speech, then you have to defend their right to say it. We feel exactly the same way about rule number 2. You can live in ways that people might want to call you a jerk, so long as you're peaceful, which means you don't violate rule number 1. We defend your right to live the way you're living, so long as you don't become an aggressor. We may and we will try to convince you to live in different ways because we think it's in everybody's interest that you do that. We need more people to live in accordance with rule number 2 for us to get to peace, but you don't have to sign on. We are not forcing you to comply with any particular moral principle. We are very post-racial in the Live and Let Live movement. What do I mean by that? We don't judge people by the color of their skin or where they're born, or what holidays they celebrate, or whether they're religious or not religious, or straight or gay. We don't care about that kind of stuff. We agree with what Dr. Martin Luther King said on this point, which is content of character. That's what we're focused on. That's what we care about in the Live and Let Live movement. And that's what we're promoting with rule number 2. Now, let me say, if you're not willing to defend the rights of other people to, let's just say, be bad humans or act in ways that are inconsistent with rule number 2, then you're really not willing to pay the price, right? This is the hard one. Just like the right to free speech, if you're not willing to defend the rights of people to utter speech that is very unpopular and offensive, you're not really willing to pay the price to get that right to free speech. We feel the same exact way about rule number 2. That's the price you got to pay. You got to tolerate other people living their lives in ways that you don't like, ways that you find immoral, unhealthy, unwise, unwarranted, not in their self-interest. While we try to convince them otherwise, the only thing we demand of them is that they don't violate rule number 1, that they do not aggress. Think of a world for a moment where everybody agrees the law's all calibrated with rule number 1. Nobody gets to aggress. That's the minimum standard we hold everybody to, including all groups, all corporations, and the government as well. Why would we ever want the government to aggress? The government is there to defend our rights, not to aggress against us or anyone else. But the cost is we got to defend the rights of others to live in ways we disagree with. That's the price we got to pay if we want to get to a free and peaceful world. Hopefully you're willing to pay that price, because if you're watching this video, you've already joined the Live and Let Live movement, which is just to say you've already signaled your agreement with the mandatory rule number 1 and the voluntary rule number 2, that we're going to do our best to try to convince you to really live your life according to those rules. And so what I ask is that you really internalize these rules. Is there ever a time when you feel like the right thing to do would be to aggress? I don't think so. I hope not. So really buy into it. I'm going to give you just a little bit of an overview in terms of how we analyze every single issue, every issue. Somebody says, Mark, how do you feel about issue X? Well, I can tell you is the first thing I look for is somebody or some group or some corporation or some government violating rule number 1. Is somebody aggressing? Because if somebody is aggressing, I can tell you how I feel about it. I'm against it. I think we should terminate that conduct immediately. Somebody's already engaged in it, we should give that person a fair trial. And if it turns out they actually violated rule number 1, we should impose a consequence on them. But if they're not violating rule number 1, then I conclude whatever they're doing, it should be legal. And that's the end of that analysis. But then I move to rule number 2, and I ask the question, is this person violating rule number 2? Well, if they are violating rule number 2, while I maintain their legal right to engage in that conduct, I do my very best to try to talk them out of it. I say, look, man, don't act this way. Be a good human. Let me explain why you should be a good human. I'm going to get into that when we get to that video in the series and talk about the deeper dive into the moral principle. But I think we have a good argument here to try to convince people. So that'll be my position. If they're not violating rule number 1 and they are violating rule number 2, we could picket them, boycott them, we could refuse to do business, we could encourage our friends not to do business, which is probably what we should do if somebody's violating rule number 2. I don't want to do business with anybody who violates rule number 2. I don't want to be friends with anybody who doesn't agree with rule number 2. I hope I never cross paths with somebody who doesn't agree with rule number 1, right? So that's what rule number 1 and rule number 2 are about. If they're not violating rule number 1 and they're not violating rule number 2, well, I still have higher moral views that are not part of Live and Let Live. That's right. The Live and Let Live philosophy is not a philosophy for life. It doesn't tell you everything about how you should feel about everything. You might have particular religious views. Even if somebody is not violating rule number 1 or rule number 2, you might still say, you know what, I still try to talk the person out of that conduct. That's fine. No problem. We all have our higher moral views that exceed rule number 2, but if they're not violating rule number 1 or rule number 2, chances are pretty good I'm going to say, look, you're not being an aggressor and you're acting consistently with what we think a good human is. Have fun. I'm absolutely not going to do anything whatsoever other than maybe encourage them to do more of it. So anyways, that's how I analyze every issue. No matter what you ask me about, the first place I'm going is somebody violating rule number 1. I don't care why they're violating rule number 1. If they're violating rule number 1, I think it should be illegal. And if they're violating rule number 2, I'm going to do everything I can to try to inspire them to act differently. There's the 30,000-foot overview. Stand by for video number 3, which you will get soon. I hope you're enjoying these videos. As always, if you have questions, just reach out, no problem. You can get a hold of me directly at Mark, M-A-R-C, @liveandletlive.org. Till next time, peace.